He didn't notice the pain in his shoulder until he saw the boy's face. And suddenly, nothing else in the room mattered. The hospital lights hummed overhead, casting that sterile, unforgiving white across everything. Polished floors, stainless steel carts, the quiet tension that lingered in every corner. And Ethan Cole sat upright on the edge of the exam bed, his tailored charcoal suit now creased at the shoulder, his cuff slightly torn where the car door had clipped him earlier that morning. A minor accident, they said, nothing serious. Just precautionary checks, but none of that held his attention anymore because across the hallway, just beyond the partially open door, a child stood in the glow of the corridor lights, small hands wrapped around the edge of a tablet, curls soft against his forehead, and when the boy lifted his head, just for a second, the world narrowed into something sharp and unrecognizable because the eyes looking back weren't just familiar. They were his, the same deep-set intensity, the same quiet storm behind them, the same way his brow tightened slightly, as if thinking too much for someone that young, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat, not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle break in rhythm that he couldn't explain as the monitor beside him continued its steady beep, indifferent to the shift happening inside him. And then the door opened wider with a soft click, breaking the moment, and she stepped in, gloved hands, calm posture, eyes focused on the chart in front of her, her voice measured, professional, untouched by whatever tension had just formed in the air. Mr. Cole, I'm going to need you to sit back so I can take a look at your shoulder. And he turned toward her slowly, something already pulling at the edges of his memory, something he couldn't quite place until she stepped closer into the light, and he saw her face clearly for the first time, and time didn't stop. It didn't shatter. It just shifted, subtly, dangerously, like something realigning beneath the surface. Amara, he said before he could stop himself, her name leaving his mouth quieter. Then he intended, and she paused. Not long, not enough for anyone else to notice, but just enough for the silence to acknowledge that it meant something. And then she looked at him, really looked this time, her expression controlled, composed, but not surprised, not shaken, just steady. In a way that told him she had already prepared for this moment long before he ever walked through those hospital doors. Mr. Cole, she repeated, her tone unchanged, her eyes giving nothing away, and that was the first thing that unsettled him. Not recognition, not emotion, but the absence of both, because Ethan Cole was not a man people forgot, and yet here she was, standing inches away, treating him like just another name on a chart, just another patient to move through the system, and somewhere behind her, the boy's laughter echoed faintly down the hall, soft, unguarded, real, and Ethan's gaze shifted again, instinctively, pulled back to that face he couldn't unsee. "Who is that kid?" he asked, the question coming out sharper than he intended, cutting through the clinical calm of the room, and Amara didn't turn, didn't follow his gaze. She simply adjusted the cuff on his sleeve with precise movements, her fingers steady, her voice even. "Please keep your arms still." And that was it. No answer, no explanation, just a boundary drawn so cleanly it almost felt rehearsed, and Ethan felt something unfamiliar press against his chest. Not anger, not yet, something closer to disorientation, because nothing in his world operated without clarity, without answers. And yet this moment refused to resolve itself into something logical, something he could control, and when the boy's voice carried again, closer this time, calling out, "Mom," the word landed in the room like a quiet detonation, not loud, not explosive, but impossible to ignore, and Ethan's eyes snapped back to her, searching now, really searching, because that one word had rearranged everything. And Amara finally moved, stepping back from him, removing her gloves with a soft snap, her gaze still avoiding his as she turned toward the door, and the boy appeared again, just outside the frame, looking up at her with complete trust, his small hand reaching for hers without hesitation, and she took it without thinking, without pause, like it was the most natural thing in the world, because to her, it was. And Ethan watched the way their hands fit together, the ease of it, the familiarity, the quiet rhythm of something built over time, something real, and his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with injury, because the more he looked, the harder it became to deny what his instincts were already telling him. The shape of the boy's jaw, the angle of his cheekbones, The way he tilted his head slightly when he looked up, it was all there, all of it. Pieces of himself reflected back at him in a form he had never seen before, and it didn't make sense. It couldn't, because Ethan Cole did not leave loose ends. He did not forget things that mattered. And yet the past had a way of slipping through even the tightest control. And as Amara led the boy away from the doorway, her voice soft now, different from the clinical tone she had used with him. "Give me a minute, Noah," she said gently, and the name settled into Ethan's mind like something important, something that would not leave, and the boy nodded, obedient, calm, before walking a few steps down the hall, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand curling slightly against the edge of the bed as he tried to piece together something that refused to stay still. "Amara," he said again, this time more firmly, and she stopped, her back still to him, her shoulders rising just slightly with a breath she didn't let him hear. "You're going to explain this." And for a moment, just a moment, the room held its breath with him, the machines, the lights, the quiet hum of the building all fading into the background as the weight of the question settled between them. And then she turned, finally meeting his eyes without hesitation, without fear. Her expression not angry, not emotional, just grounded in something deeper than either of those things. "There's nothing to explain," she said, her voice calm but absolute. And Ethan almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was impossible. Because everything about this moment demanded an explanation, demanded clarity, demanded control, and yet she stood there like she owed him none of it, like whatever truth existed here belonged entirely to her. And that was when he realized something that unsettled him more than anything else so far. He was not in control of this situation, not in this room, not with her, not with that child standing just outside his reach. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole didn't know what came next. The silence did not break when she spoke. It thickened, stretching between them until even the steady rhythm of the monitor felt too loud for the space it occupied, and Ethan held her gaze longer this time, not with the casual confidence he carried into boardrooms or negotiations, but with something sharper, more focused, because whatever this was, it was no longer something he could dismiss as coincidence, not after the way the boy looked at her, not after the way she said his name. And especially not after the way that child's face had mirrored his own so precisely it felt like looking into a memory he did not remember creating. "There is always something to explain," he said finally, his voice lower now, controlled but edged with a tension that had not been there before, and Amara did not move, did not step closer or further away. She simply stood there with the same quiet steadiness that had unsettled him from the moment she walked into the room. "Not everything belongs to you, Ethan," she replied, and hearing his name again, spoken without hesitation, without title, without distance, landed differently this time, because it confirmed what he already knew but had not fully accepted, that she remembered everything, even if she chose not to show it, and that meant whatever stood between them now had roots that went deeper than this room, deeper than this moment, deeper than whatever version of the past he had convinced himself was complete. "You do not get to decide that," he said, pushing himself slightly off the edge of the bed despite the pull in his shoulder, ignoring the discomfort because it was irrelevant compared to the pressure building behind his ribs. "If that child is connected to me in any way, then I have every right to know." And the words hung there, heavier than he expected, because saying them out loud made the possibility real in a way he could no longer contain. And for the first time since he arrived, something flickered across her face. Not fear, not panic, just a brief tightening at the corner of her eyes, like a door closing before it could fully open. "You are making assumptions," she said, her tone still calm, but now carrying a weight that had not been there before, and Ethan almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was familiar, that same careful deflection he had seen in negotiations. When someone was protecting something they could not afford to reveal too soon. "Then correct me," he said, taking a step closer, his presence filling the space in a way it always had. But this time it did not shift her stance, did not make her retreat. She held her ground with a quiet strength that did not need to prove itself, and that unsettled him more than resistance ever could. "Tell me I am wrong," he continued, his voice softer now, not less intense, just more precise. "Tell me that boy Has nothing to do with me, and I will walk out of here and never ask again. And for a moment, the air between them stilled completely, because they both knew that was not true. Not anymore, not after what he had seen. But the offer still stood there, fragile and impossible at the same time. And Amara looked at him fully now, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable, and when she spoke, her voice did not rise, did not tremble. It simply settled into the space like something inevitable. You would not walk away, she said, and the certainty in her tone landed harder than any accusation, because it stripped away the illusion of control he had been holding on to. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the truth of that statement pressing against him in a way he could not deny. No, he admitted quietly. I would not. And that was the moment something shifted, not in the room, not in the situation, but in the way he approached it, because this was no longer about proving something. It was about understanding something he had already begun to believe. And down the hall, Noah's voice drifted back again, softer this time, talking to someone, laughing lightly, unaware of the gravity building just a few feet away, and Ethan's attention pulled toward it instinctively, like something inside him recognized that sound before his mind could catch up. How old is he? He asked, the question slipping out before he could measure it. And Amara did not answer immediately, not because she did not hear him, but because she was choosing whether or not to give him that peace. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried more weight than anything she had said so far. 5. And the number settled into Ethan's chest like a calculation. He did not want to complete. 5 years. 5 years of a life existing without him. 5 years of first steps, first words, first moments that he had not been there to witness. Not because he could not, but because he did not know. And the distinction mattered more than he expected, because it meant this was not something he had chosen to ignore. It was something that had been kept from him. And yet even that thought felt incomplete, because the memory of that night, brief and distant as it was, began to surface in fragments he had not revisited in years. A quiet conversation, a promise made too quickly, a departure that had seemed necessary at the time, and then nothing, no follow-up, no connection, just silence that he had accepted without question because his life had moved forward the way it always did, fast, structured, controlled. But now that silence felt different. Now it felt intentional, and his gaze returned to her with a sharper edge. You knew, he said, not accusing, just stating what had become clear. You knew and you never told me. And this time, Amara did not deflect, did not soften the truth. She met it directly. I knew, she said, and the simplicity of that admission carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it confirmed what he had already begun to piece together. And Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the effort to hold everything in place. Why? He asked, and it was the first time his voice carried something beyond control, something closer to genuine confusion, because in his world, information was currency, connection was leverage, and withholding something this significant did not align with anything he understood. And Amara watched him for a long moment before answering, not because she needed time, but because she was choosing how much of the truth he was ready to hear. Because you left, she said finally, and there was no accusation in it, no raised voice, just a statement delivered with the same calm clarity she had maintained from the beginning, and somehow that made it heavier, because it was not about what he did after, it was about what he did not do at all. And Ethan opened his mouth to respond, to correct, to explain, but nothing came out immediately because the simplicity of her words cut through every justification he might have offered. And in the space that followed, the weight of 5 years settled fully between them, not loud, not dramatic, just present in a way that could not be undone. And down the hall, Noah's laughter rose again, bright and unburdened, completely untouched by the tension that defined the moment. And Ethan stood there, caught between the life he had built and the one he had never known existed, realizing for the first time that whatever came next would not be something he could control, only something he would have to face. The number did not leave his mind once she said it. 5 years. It echoed quietly beneath every thought, threading through everything he had built since then, every deal, every decision, every carefully structured day that had moved forward without interruption. And now it sat there like something unfinished, something he had never accounted for. And Ethan remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed somewhere just past her shoulder, as if the answer might still reveal itself in the space between what he knew and what he had just learned. But nothing shifted, nothing resolved, because the truth had already been placed in front of him, simple and unmovable. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, not softer, not weaker, just grounded in something more deliberate. "You decided that for both of us," he said. And Amara did not react the way most people would when confronted with a statement like that. She did not defend herself immediately, did not raise her voice or try to justify. She simply held his gaze with that same steady composure, as if she had already walked through this conversation 100 times in her own mind and reached a place where his reaction could not shift her position. "No," she replied, her tone even. "I made a decision for my child." And the distinction landed sharply, because it reframed everything he had just said. It pulled the focus away from him, away from what he felt entitled to, and placed it squarely on something he had not yet been part of. And that realization unsettled him in a way he could not immediately correct, because for the first time in a long time, the situation was not centered around his authority, his influence, or his ability to change the outcome. It was centered around a life that had grown without him, and he had no control over how that had been shaped. And down the hallway, the soft sound of footsteps approached again, lighter this time, hesitant, and Ethan turned just slightly, enough to see Noah standing near the doorway, his small hand resting against the frame, his eyes moving between them with quiet curiosity, not afraid, not nervous, just observant in a way that felt far older than his years. And for a moment, neither adult spoke, because the presence of the child changed the air in the room completely. It stripped away the tension that had been building and replaced it with something more fragile, something that could not be handled with the same sharp edges. And Noah tilted his head slightly, studying Ethan with the same intensity that had already unsettled him once before. "Mom," he said softly, "is he the doctor?" And the question was simple, innocent, but it landed with a weight that neither of them could ignore. And Amara moved immediately, stepping toward him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder in a way that was both protective and grounding. "No," she said, her voice softer now, different from the tone she had used with Ethan. "He is just someone from work." And the words were chosen carefully, not a lie, not entirely, but not the truth either. And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest again, because hearing himself reduced to that, just someone, stripped of everything else he represented, felt more disorienting than any confrontation could have been. And Noah nodded, accepting the answer without question, his attention already shifting to something else, something lighter, because for him, the moment did not carry the same weight. It was just another interaction in a day filled with small, ordinary moments. And that contrast hit Ethan harder than anything else so far, because it highlighted the distance between what this was for him and what it was for the child. And before he could stop himself, he spoke again, this time directly to the boy, his voice instinctively adjusting, losing some of its sharpness. "What is your name?" he asked, and Amara's hand tightened slightly on Noah's shoulder, not enough to pull him back, just enough to signal that this moment mattered. And Noah looked up at her first, as if checking, and when she did not stop him, he answered, "Noah," he said simply, and Ethan nodded once, the name settling into him more deeply now that he had heard it from the source. "That is a strong name," he said, and Noah gave a small shrug, like it was not something he had thought much about. And then, without hesitation, he asked the question that neither adult had been willing to say out loud yet. "Why do you look like me?" And the room went completely still, not because the question was unexpected, but because of how naturally it had been spoken, without accusation, without confusion, just a simple observation stated as fact. And Ethan felt the impact of it immediately, sharper than anything else so far, because hearing it from the child removed all doubt, all distance. It brought the truth directly into the center of the moment where it could no longer be managed or redirected. And Amara inhaled slowly, her posture shifting just slightly as she prepared to respond. But before she could, Ethan spoke, not thinking, not calculating, just reacting to something that had already taken root inside him. "That is something we are still figuring out," he said, and the words surprised even him as they left his mouth, because they carried an openness he did not usually allow. a willingness to admit uncertainty that did not align with the way he typically operated. And Noah considered that answer for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly in a way that mirrored Ethan's so closely it was almost unsettling. And then he nodded, accepting it in the same way children accept things that do not fully make sense yet, trusting that clarity will come later. And Amara watched the exchange carefully, her expression unreadable, but her presence unmistakably protective, not blocking the interaction, not shutting it down, just holding the boundaries in place while allowing the moment to unfold. And Ethan became aware of that too, the balance she was maintaining, the control she still held over how much access he had. And for the first time, he did not push against it immediately, because something in him recognized that forcing this would only break something that had not even had the chance to form yet. And the silence that followed was different now, not as tense, not as sharp, just filled with the weight of what had been acknowledged without being fully defined. And as Noah shifted his attention again, distracted by something down the hall, Amara gently guided him away, her hand resting at his back as they stepped out of the doorway. And Ethan remained where he was, watching them leave, the image of their connection, their rhythm, their quiet understanding staying with him long after they disappeared from view. And for the first time since this began, the realization settled fully into place, not as a question, not as a suspicion, but as something real, something undeniable, that whatever this was, whatever it became, it was no longer something he could observe from a distance. It was something he was already a part of, whether he had been there for the beginning or not. The hallway felt longer when he stepped out of the room, not because the distance had changed, but because every step now carried something heavier than before, something that followed him instead of staying behind. And Ethan moved slowly, his eyes scanning the space ahead until he found them again. Amara seated near the far end, her posture relaxed but alert, one arm resting along the back of the chair, while Noah leaned slightly against her side, focused on a small book in his hands, his legs swinging lightly above the polished floor. And for a moment, Ethan did not approach. He simply watched, because what unfolded in front of him did not belong to him yet. It was a rhythm already formed, a quiet system of gestures and glances that required no explanation between them. And he noticed the small details, the way Amara brushed her fingers lightly over Noah's shoulder when he shifted, the way Noah leaned closer without looking up, trusting the contact without needing to confirm it. And something about that ease unsettled him more than anything else had so far, because it represented time, not a single moment, not a coincidence, but years of presence, years of consistency, something that could not be recreated with intention alone. And as he stood there, the controlled environment of the hospital seemed to fade into the background, replaced by something more personal, more difficult to navigate. And when he finally stepped forward, the sound of his shoes against the floor drew Noah's attention first, the boy looking up before Amara did, his expression curious, but calm. And Ethan slowed slightly as he approached, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because this moment required something different from him, something he was not used to offering without calculation. And when Amara finally looked up, her gaze met his without surprise, without tension, just acknowledgement, as if she had already known he would come. "You should be resting," she said, her voice steady, not dismissive, just factual. And Ethan gave a small nod, stopping a few feet away, close enough to be present, but not close enough to intrude. "I am fine," he replied, and for once, the statement was not about control, it was about focus, because the discomfort in his shoulder had become irrelevant compared to everything else unfolding. And Noah closed his book slowly, his attention shifting fully now, his eyes moving between them with quiet interest. And Ethan noticed again the way the boy observed, not passively, but with a kind of awareness that felt familiar. "Do you work here too?" Noah asked, his voice light, carrying none of the weight that defined the adult conversation. And Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, considering the answer, not because it was complicated, but because it mattered how he positioned himself now. "No," he said, his tone even. "I do not work here." And Noah nodded, accepting the answer easily. "Then why are you here?" he continued. And Ethan allowed a small breath to leave his chest, something close to a quiet exhale of truth. "Because I needed to be," he said, and the words felt different as soon as they were spoken, less precise, less controlled, but somehow more accurate than anything else he could have offered, and Noah seemed to consider that, his head tilting slightly again, before a small smile touched his expression, like the answer made sense in a way that did not require further explanation, and beside him, Amara remained still, her attention divided but present, watching the interaction unfold. Without interrupting, without guiding it, just allowing it to exist within the boundaries she had already set, and Ethan became aware of that again. The balance she maintained, the quiet authority she held over the space without needing to assert it, and for the first time, he did not try to challenge it, because something in him understood that this was not a negotiation, not a situation to be managed or redirected. It was something that required patience, something he had not had to practice in a long time. Noah, Amara said gently, her hand resting lightly against his arm. Why do not you go finish your drawing with Mrs. Carter? And Noah looked up at her, then back at Ethan, as if measuring whether leaving would mean missing something important, and after a brief pause, he nodded, sliding off the chair with an easy motion before walking down the hall, his small footsteps fading into the soft ambient noise of the hospital. And when he was out of sight, the space between Ethan and Amara shifted again, the absence of the child bringing back a different kind of weight, quieter, more focused, and Ethan stepped a little closer this time. Not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough to signal that he was not leaving this conversation unfinished. You cannot keep doing this, he said, his voice low, controlled but firm, and Amara did not react. Immediately, her gaze following Noah until he turned the corner, ensuring he was fully out of earshot before she responded. Doing what? She asked, her tone neutral, but not dismissive, and Ethan held her gaze, steady, deliberate. Acting like I do not exist in his life, he said. And there it was, not an accusation, not a demand, just a statement of something that had already begun to take shape inside him. And Amara's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted slightly, like she was acknowledging the direction this was moving without conceding anything yet. You did not exist in his life, she replied, and the words landed clean, without hesitation, without softness, just truth presented without decoration, and Ethan felt that again, that sharp, quiet impact that came not from confrontation, but from clarity, because there was no room to argue with something that had already happened, no way to rewrite what had already been lived. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence settling between them not as tension, but as recognition of something that could not be undone. And when Ethan spoke again, his voice carried something different now, not less controlled, but more grounded, more aware of the weight behind his words. That does not mean I do not belong there now, he said, and Amara looked at him. Fully, her eyes steady, searching not for weakness, but for intention, for something real beneath the surface of everything he represented. And for the first time, Ethan did not try to present himself as anything other than what he was in that moment. Not a CEO, not a man used to control, just someone standing at the edge of something he did not fully understand yet, but knew he could not walk away from. And the quiet that followed was not empty. It was filled with the beginning of something. Neither of them could fully define yet, but both understood would not be simple, would not be quick, and would not be something either of them could control alone. The words did not settle easily after he said them. They lingered in the space between them, not as a challenge, not as a demand, but as something heavier, something that could not be taken back once it was spoken. And Amara held his gaze without flinching, her expression steady, her posture unchanged, but there was a shift beneath it, subtle, controlled, like a current moving under still water. Belonging is not something you claim, she said after a moment, her voice calm but firm. It is something you earn. And the sentence landed with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, and Ethan did not respond immediately, not because he did not have an answer, but because for the first time, the answer he would normally give did not fit here. It did not apply to this. And that realization slowed him in a way that felt unfamiliar, forcing him to stand still in a moment he would usually try to move past. And the quiet stretched between them again, not uncomfortable, but deliberate. And somewhere down the hall, the distant sound of Noah's voice rose briefly, light and unburdened, followed by a soft laugh from another staff member. And that sound carried back into the space like a reminder of what was at stake. not in terms of control or outcome, but in terms of something far more fragile, something that could not be approached with the same force he used everywhere else in his life. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling slightly, as if releasing something he had not realized he was holding. "Then tell me how," he said, and the simplicity of the question shifted the tone of the moment completely, because it was not framed as authority, not presented as expectation. It was a request, direct and unguarded in a way that did not come naturally to him. And Amara noticed that, the absence of pressure behind the words, the shift from control to intention, and for the first time since he had walked into her world again, she did not respond immediately, not out of resistance, but out of consideration, because what he was asking for was not simple. It was not something she could hand over or define in a single sentence. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet weight that reflected that. "You start by understanding that this is not about you," she said, and Ethan nodded once, not because it was easy to accept, but because he recognized the truth in it, even if it went against everything he was used to. "It is about him," she continued, her gaze steady, "his life, his routine, his sense of stability. You do not get to step into that and rearrange it because you just found out it exists." And each word was measured, not harsh, not defensive, just clear, and Ethan listened without interrupting, something he rarely did outside of controlled environments. But here, there was no advantage in speaking too soon, no benefit in pushing ahead without fully understanding the ground he was stepping onto. "I am not here to rearrange anything," he said after a moment, his voice low, deliberate. "I am here because I should have been here from the beginning." And the admission did not come easily. It did not carry the polished certainty he usually presented, but it was real, and Amara saw that, even if she did not respond to it directly, because what mattered was not what he said now. It was what he would do next, and actions, unlike words, could not be shaped in the moment to fit the situation. They required time, consistency, proof, and that was something he had not yet provided. And before either of them could continue, a voice called softly from down the hall, "Amara, we need you in room 12. And she turned slightly, acknowledging the call with a brief nod, her attention shifting back to the responsibilities that had not paused for this conversation. And when she looked at Ethan again, her expression had returned to something more neutral, more contained, not because the moment had passed, but because it had been set aside, temporarily, in favor of something immediate. "I have to go," she said, and there was no apology in it, no explanation, just fact, and Ethan understood that, stepping back slightly to give her space without being asked, and for a second, neither of them moved, the pause holding just long enough to acknowledge that this was not finished, that whatever had started here would continue beyond this hallway, beyond this moment. And then she turned, her steps steady as she walked toward the next room, her presence shifting seamlessly back into the role she had built for herself. And Ethan remained where he was, watching her go, the contrast between the woman he remembered and the one standing in front of him now becoming more defined with every passing second, because she was not waiting for anything from him, not validation, not support, not even acknowledgement. She had already built everything she needed without him, and that realization settled into him with a weight that did not feel like loss, but like responsibility, something that had been absent before, something that now demanded his attention in a way nothing else had. And as he turned slightly, his gaze moving down the hall where Noah had disappeared earlier, he saw him again, seated at a small table with a set of crayons spread out in front of him, his head bent in concentration as he drew, completely absorbed in the simple task. And Ethan found himself walking toward him without fully deciding to, his steps slower now, more measured, as if approaching something that required care rather than certainty. And when he reached the table, Noah looked up again, his expression brightening slightly in recognition, not because of who Ethan was, but because he was familiar now, someone who had already stepped into his space once before, and that was enough for a child. "You came back," Noah said, his voice carrying a quiet note of approval, and Ethan nodded, a small, genuine gesture that felt different from anything he had offered earlier. "I said I needed to be here," he replied, and Noah smiled faintly, returning his attention to the paper in front of him. "I am drawing my house," he said, holding up the page slightly, and Ethan leaned down just enough to see it clearly. A simple structure, uneven lines, bright colors filling the space in a way that did not follow rules but made sense in its own way. And beside the house were two figures, one taller, one smaller, both drawn with the same careful attention, and Ethan's gaze lingered there for a moment longer than he intended, not because of what was missing, but because of what was already complete without him. And Noah pointed to the figures with a small sense of pride. "That is me and my mom," he said, and Ethan nodded again, his chest tightening slightly, not with regret, not yet, but with awareness, because for the first time, the reality of what he had not been part of was no longer abstract. It was visible, tangible, drawn in bright colors on a piece of paper that did not include him. And as Noah continued adding details to the drawing, completely focused, completely at ease, Ethan straightened slowly, his gaze shifting once more down the hallway, where Amara had disappeared, and the path in front of him did not feel clear. It did not feel structured or predictable, but it was there, undeniable, waiting for him to step into it, not as the man who controlled outcomes, but as the one who had to learn how to be present without rewriting what already existed. The crayon moved in slow, careful strokes across the paper, and Ethan found himself watching the way Noah concentrated, his small fingers gripping the color too tightly at times, then adjusting without frustration, as if he had already learned that mistakes did not require panic, only patience. And that detail stayed with Ethan longer than it should have, because it was not something children were born knowing. It was something they were taught, something repeated over time until it became instinct, and that meant someone had been there, guiding, steady, consistent, and he did not need to look down the hallway to know who that had been. And for a moment, the noise of the hospital returned around him, distant conversations, the rolling of carts, the soft chime of machines, but none of it pulled his attention away from the quiet scene in front of him, because for the first time, he was not measuring a situation by outcome or advantage. He was observing something that existed without him, something that did not need him to function, and that realization did not push him away. It grounded him, forced him to approach this differently than anything else in his life. "Do you always draw here?" he asked, his voice low enough not to disrupt the focus Noah had settled into. And Noah nodded without looking up. "After school," he said simply, filling in a bright section of the house with a shade of blue that went slightly outside the lines but did not seem to bother him. "Mom says it helps me relax." And Ethan gave a small nod, the explanation landing easily, because it fit with everything he had already seen, the structure, the consistency, the quiet sense of routine that had shaped this child's world without him. And he leaned slightly against the edge of the table, careful not to crowd the space, not to impose himself into something that had not been built for him yet. "That is a good habit," he said, and Noah glanced up briefly, offering a small smile before returning to his drawing. And Ethan noticed the way the boy accepted that comment, not seeking approval, not reacting strongly, just acknowledging it and moving on. And that subtle independence carried a weight he could not ignore, because it spoke to a stability that had been earned, not given. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet between them settling into something more natural, less defined by tension and more by presence. And then Noah picked up another crayon, pausing briefly before asking, "Do you have a house?" And the question caught Ethan off guard in a way that had nothing to do with its complexity, because the answer was obvious. He had multiple homes, properties across different cities, spaces designed with precision and luxury. But none of that fit the way the question had been asked, and he realized that immediately, adjusting his response not out of calculation, but out of instinct. "Yes," he said, "I do." And Noah nodded again, as if that confirmed something simple. "Is it big?" he asked, and Ethan allowed a faint breath of something close to amusement to pass through him, not at the question, but at how uncomplicated it was, how direct. And he answered honestly, "Yes, it is." And Noah considered that for a second, then returned to his drawing without further comment, as if the information had served its purpose and did not need to be expanded. And Ethan remained there, watching the small movements, the steady rhythm of a child fully engaged in something that required no external validation. And he realized something then, something that shifted the way he had been approaching this entire situation. that his presence here was not about proving anything, not about inserting himself into a role that had already been filled. It was about learning how to exist alongside something that had grown without him, and that required a different kind of effort, one that could not be rushed or controlled. And as that thought settled into place, a familiar sound of footsteps approached from behind, measured, purposeful, and he did not need to turn to know it was Amara, because the energy of the space shifted slightly in a way that was distinct, grounded. And when she stepped into view, her eyes moved first to Noah, checking him instinctively before lifting to Ethan, her expression neutral but attentive. "We are heading out soon," she said, her voice calm, and Noah nodded, finishing the last part of his drawing before setting the crayon down with a small sense of completion, and Ethan straightened slightly, stepping back just enough to give them space, but not stepping away entirely. "Not this time. Can I walk you out?" he asked, and the question was simple, but it carried a different kind of weight now, because it was not about control, it was about permission, and Amara studied him for a moment, not searching for the right answer, but for the intention behind the request, and whatever she saw there, she did not reject it. "We will be heading to the parking garage," she said. Not quite an answer, not quite a refusal, but something in between, and Ethan nodded once, understanding the boundary without needing it to be explained further. And together, they moved down the hallway, Noah walking slightly ahead. Now, his small steps confident, familiar with the path, and Ethan matched their pace without thinking, not leading, not following too far behind, just present. And as they reached the elevator, the doors opened with a soft chime, and the three of them stepped inside, the confined space shifting the dynamic again, bringing them closer physically while maintaining the distance that still existed between them in every other way. And Noah leaned lightly against Amara's side, his earlier energy settling into something quieter as the day began to wind down, and Ethan watched the reflection in the mirrored wall, the three figures standing together, not connected, not yet, but no longer completely separate either. And when the elevator reached the lower level, the doors opened into the cool, dim space of the parking garage, the air carrying a faint echo of distant movement, and Noah stepped out first, his attention already shifting toward a familiar car parked a few rows ahead, and Amara followed, her hand resting lightly at his back, guiding without directing, and Ethan stepped out last, the sound of his shoes echoing slightly against the concrete floor. And for a moment, they all stopped near the car, the day's interactions settling into a quiet pause, and Noah turned toward him one more time, his expression open, uncomplicated. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" he asked. And the question landed with a simplicity that made it impossible to answer lightly, because it was not about scheduling, not about convenience. It was about presence, and Ethan met his gaze, steady, deliberate. And for once, he did not calculate the answer. He did not measure the implications. He simply responded with the truth as it stood in that moment. "Yes," he said, and Noah nodded, accepting that without hesitation, without doubt, because children believed what was presented to them clearly. And as he climbed into the car, his attention already shifting to something else, Ethan remained standing there for a second longer, his gaze lifting to Amara, and she held it briefly, not confirming, not denying, just acknowledging what had been said. And then she opened the driver's door, stepping inside without another word, and as the car pulled away, the sound of the engine fading into the quiet of the garage, Ethan stood there alone, not with the sense of control he was used to carrying, but with something far more unfamiliar, a commitment that had not been planned, not been negotiated, but had been spoken into existence. And for the first time, he understood that what came next would not be determined by what he wanted, but by what he was willing to prove. The next morning did not arrive quietly. It pressed forward with a clarity that felt sharper than usual, as if the day itself carried an expectation he could not ignore. And Ethan stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the city stretching beneath him in perfect lines of order and motion, everything exactly where it should be, everything moving according to systems he understood, and yet none of it held his focus the way it normally did, because his mind had already moved ahead, already stepped into a space that did not follow the same rules. And the reflection staring back at him in the glass looked composed, controlled, unchanged. But there was something different behind his eyes, something that had not been there before, and when his phone buzzed on the counter behind him, the sound cut cleanly through the silence, pulling him back into a world that still expected him to operate the way he always had. Mr. Cole, the board meeting has been moved to 10:30, and your flight to San Francisco is confirmed for this afternoon. His assistant's voice came through steady and efficient, listing details that would normally structure his entire day, and Ethan remained still for a moment, listening, not because the information was new, but because the relevance of it had shifted in a way he had not anticipated. "Cancel the flight," he said, his voice calm, decisive, and there was a brief pause on the other end, not confusion, just recalibration, because adjustments like that were rare. "Understood." "In the meeting?" she asked, and Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the city, but his thoughts were no longer there. "Reschedule," he replied, and the call ended shortly after, leaving the room quiet again. But this time, the silence felt intentional, like something had been cleared rather than interrupted, and within the hour, he was back in the hospital parking garage, the same space that had felt unfamiliar the day before, now carrying a different weight, not as a place he had stumbled into, but as somewhere he had chosen to return to. And as he stepped out of his car, the air carried the same cool echo, the same distant hum of movement, but his pace was different now, not rushed, not uncertain, just steady. And when he entered the building, the routine of the environment moved around him without interruption, nurses passing, patients waiting, conversations flowing, none of it shifting to acknowledge him. And that anonymity, that absence of recognition, felt strangely appropriate, because here, he was not defined by anything he had built outside these walls. And as he moved down the hallway, his gaze settled ahead, instinctively searching for something specific now, something that had already begun to anchor his attention. And when he reached the small seating area, he saw Noah again, in the same place as before, legs swinging lightly, a different set of crayons spread out in front of him, his focus locked onto a new drawing, and Ethan slowed as he approached, not wanting to interrupt the moment, not wanting to impose. And when Noah looked up, the recognition was immediate, uncomplicated. "You came back," he said again, this time with a note of certainty instead of curiosity. And Ethan nodded once, the response simple, but grounded in something that carried more weight than it had the day before. "I said I would," he replied, and Noah smiled faintly, returning to his drawing without hesitation, because to him, consistency was enough. And Ethan took a seat nearby, not directly across, not too close, just within the same space, allowing the interaction to unfold naturally. And for a while, neither of them spoke, the quiet settling into something more comfortable, less defined by the unfamiliarity of the day before. And Ethan found himself watching again, not analyzing, not evaluating, just observing, the small details that had started to form a picture he could no longer ignore. And when Noah finally spoke again, his voice carried the same easy tone. "I told my teacher about you," he said, and Ethan glanced at him, surprised by the statement, not because of what it meant, but because of how naturally it had been included in the boy's world. "You did," he replied, and Noah nodded, adding another color to the page. "I said I met someone who looks like me." And the words landed without hesitation, without awareness of their weight, just a simple truth shared in the way children share things that matter to them. And Ethan felt something shift again, something deeper this time, because the connection was no longer contained to a single moment. It had already begun to extend beyond it, into conversations, into spaces he was not present for. And that realization carried a responsibility he could not ignore. And before he could respond, a familiar presence entered the space. Amara's steps measured, her attention moving first to Noah before lifting to Ethan. And there was no surprise in her expression, only acknowledgement, as if this outcome had been expected the moment he said he would return. "You came back," she said, echoing the words her son had spoken earlier, and Ethan met her gaze steadily. "I said I would," he repeated, and the simplicity of the exchange carried something unspoken beneath it, something that both of them recognized without needing to define it. And Amara's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than before, not searching for answers, but measuring consistency, something that could only be proven over time. And then she shifted her attention back to Noah, her hand resting lightly against his shoulder as she glanced at the drawing. "That looks good," she said softly, and Noah smiled, leaning slightly into her touch without breaking his focus. And Ethan watched that interaction again, the ease of it, the familiarity. And this time, instead of feeling like an outsider observing something complete, he felt something else, something quieter, something that did not demand immediate inclusion, but acknowledged the possibility of it. And as the moment settled, the distance between them remained, but it no longer felt absolute. It felt like something that could be crossed, not with force, not with expectation, but with time. And Ethan understood that now in a way he had not the day before. That this was not about stepping in, it was about showing up, again and again, until his presence was no longer a disruption, but a part of the rhythm itself. Time did not rush forward after that morning. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, as if testing whether his presence would remain or fade like everything else that had once demanded his attention. And Ethan returned again the next day, and the day after that. Not with announcements, not with expectations, just with the same quiet consistency that had begun to shape something unspoken between them. And each time, the hospital greeted him the same way, indifferent, steady, untouched by who he was, outside its walls. And that sameness became part of the rhythm, part of what allowed him to step into this space without disrupting it. And Noah began to expect him without asking. The initial curiosity replaced by something simpler, something closer to familiarity. The way he would glance up from his drawings with a small nod, not surprised anymore, just acknowledging that Ethan had kept his word again. And that small shift carried more weight than anything else, because it was not built on promises, it was built on repetition, and Amara noticed it too. Not in the way she spoke, not in the way she moved, but in the way she watched, her attention more measured now, less guarded. Not because she trusted him yet, but because she was observing something she had not seen before, consistency without pressure, presence without control. And one afternoon, as the late sunlight filtered faintly through the high windows, casting soft lines across the hallway floor, Ethan sat beside Noah again, the small table between them scattered with markers instead of crayons this time, the colors sharper, more defined, and Noah held one up thoughtfully, considering where to place it. "Do you know how to draw trees?" he asked, and Ethan paused, not because the question was difficult, but because it was unexpected, and for a moment, he almost answered the way he would have in any other situation, direct, efficient. But something in him shifted, recognizing that this was not about accuracy, it was about engagement. "I think I can try," he said instead, and Noah handed him a marker without hesitation, as if the answer had already been accepted before it was given. And Ethan took it, leaning slightly over the paper, his movements slower than usual, more deliberate, as he sketched out a simple shape, uneven at first, then adjusting, not perfect, not precise, but real in a way that did not require refinement. And Noah watched closely, his eyes following every line. And when Ethan finished, the result was not impressive, not by any standard he would normally measure himself against. But Noah smiled, a small, genuine expression that carried no expectation beyond the moment itself. "That is good," he said, and Ethan felt something settle quietly inside him, not pride, not satisfaction, just a recognition that this, whatever it was, mattered in a way that could not be quantified. And across the room, Amara stood at the nurse's station, her attention divided between charts and the scene unfolding in front of her. And for a moment, she allowed herself to pause, to observe without interruption, because what she saw was not forced, not calculated. It was simple, and that simplicity carried a weight she had not expected. And when Noah added the tree to his drawing, placing it beside the house, beside the two figures he always drew, Ethan noticed something else this time. A small empty space left on the other side, not filled, not defined, just there, and he did not comment on it, did not ask, because he understood now that not everything needed to be explained immediately. Some things existed in between, waiting to take shape on their own, and the afternoon moved forward without urgency, the quiet rhythm of the hospital continuing around them. And when Amara finally approached, her steps steady, her presence grounding the moment as it always did, Noah looked up immediately. "We made a tree," he said, his voice carrying a quiet sense of accomplishment, and Amara glanced at the paper, her eyes moving briefly to Ethan before returning to her son. "That looks good." she said, her tone soft, and Ethan noticed something then, not in her words, but in the way she allowed the moment to exist without interruption, without correction, and that subtle shift did not go unnoticed, because it meant something had changed, not dramatically, not completely, but enough to alter the space between them. And as Noah gathered his markers, carefully placing them back into the box with a level of order that mirrored the environment he had been raised in, Ethan stood slowly, his movements no longer hesitant, but still, measured, aware. And when he looked at Amara, there was no question in his expression this time, no demand, just acknowledgement of what had been building, and she met his gaze briefly, her eyes steady, not offering approval, not offering rejection, just recognizing that something had shifted in a way neither of them could ignore. And as they walked toward the elevator together, Noah slightly ahead again. The small distance between them felt different now, not as a barrier, but a space that could be crossed, slowly, carefully, without breaking what had already been built. And when the doors closed behind them, the reflection in the mirrored wall showed 3 figures again. But this time, the distance between them was not as defined, not as absolute. And Ethan understood then that this was how it would happen, not in a single moment, not with a declaration, but in these small, consistent steps, repeated until they formed something real, something that did not need to be forced, because it had been allowed to grow on its own. The days began to layer over each other in a quiet sequence that no longer felt accidental, each return building on the last without announcement, without interruption, and Ethan found himself adjusting his world around something that did not revolve around him for the first time in years. Meetings moved, flights delayed, priorities recalibrated not because he was forced to, but because something in him had shifted enough to allow it, and the hospital became a fixed point in his schedule, not as an obligation, but as a place where time moved differently, where outcomes were not immediate and progress was not measured in results, but in presence. And that difference changed the way he approached everything within those walls. And Noah had begun to expect him in a way that no longer required confirmation. The small glance toward the hallway at certain times of day, the slight lift in his posture when footsteps echoed closer, all of it subtle but consistent, and Ethan noticed those patterns now, not because he was looking for them, but because he had learned to pay attention in a way he had not before. And one afternoon, as the quiet hum of the hospital carried on around them, Noah sat with a new sheet of paper, his markers arranged neatly to the side, and when Ethan approached, he did not look up immediately, as if he already knew who it was without needing to check. "I am drawing something different today," Noah said, his voice steady, focused, and Ethan took his usual seat nearby, not intruding, just present. "What are you drawing?" he asked, and Noah hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether to reveal it yet, then turned the paper slightly, just enough for Ethan to see. And this time, the drawing had changed. The house was still there, the tree beside it, the 2 familiar figures standing near the door, but the empty space that had once remained untouched was now filled. A 3rd figure drawn with careful attention, slightly taller, placed just outside the door, not fully inside, but no longer absent either. And Ethan's gaze lingered on that figure longer than he intended, not because it was detailed, not because it was precise, but because of what it represented, something that had shifted without being discussed, something that had taken shape on its own. And Noah watched him for a second, then spoke in a tone that carried no uncertainty. "That is you," he said, and the words settled into the moment with a quiet finality that did not require explanation, and Ethan felt the weight of it immediately. Not overwhelming, not dramatic, just present in a way that could not be ignored, because this was not a question, it was not a possibility, it was an inclusion, simple and unguarded. And for a moment, he did not respond, not because he did not know what to say, but because the significance of it required something more than the kind of answers he was used to giving. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, more grounded. "Thank you," he said. And Noah nodded once, satisfied with that, as if the acknowledgement was enough, and returned to his drawing, adding small details around the edges without hesitation. And across the room, Amara stood still for just a moment longer than usual, her attention fixed on the paper in a way she could not fully mask, because she understood what that meant in a way Ethan was only beginning to grasp. that children did not include people lightly. They did not shift their understanding of the world without reason. And whatever had been building between them had reached a point where it had become real to Noah, not as a concept, but as part of his everyday life. And that realization carried a weight she could not ignore, because it meant the situation had moved beyond her control in some ways, not in a negative sense, but in a way that required her to reconsider boundaries she had carefully maintained. And when she approached them, her steps slower than usual, her presence quieter, Noah looked up with the same easy expression he always had. "I added him," he said, pointing to the drawing without hesitation, and Amara's gaze followed his finger, resting on the third figure. And for a moment, she did not speak, not because she disagreed, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood that whatever she said next would shape how this continued. And she chose her words carefully, not to control the outcome, but to respect what had already begun to form. "It looks good," she said finally, her voice soft, and Noah smiled, returning to his drawing as if the matter had already been settled. And Ethan looked at her then, not searching for approval, not asking for permission, just acknowledging that something had shifted in a way neither of them could undo. And she met his gaze briefly, her expression steady, not giving more than she was ready to, but no longer holding him at the same distance either. And that subtle change carried more meaning than any direct conversation could have, because it was not spoken, it was allowed. And as the afternoon moved forward, the rhythm remained steady, but the dynamic had changed, not drastically, not in a way that disrupted what had been built, but in a way that expanded it, creating space where there had once been none. And when it was time to leave, Noah gathered his things with the same quiet care he always had, holding the drawing close as they walked toward the elevator, and Ethan followed, not as an outsider anymore, not fully inside either, but somewhere in between, a place that required patience, consistency, and understanding. And as the elevator doors closed, the reflection showed them again, three figures standing closer than before, not perfectly aligned, not fully connected, but no longer separate in the way they once were. And Ethan understood then that what had changed was not just the situation, it was the way he moved within it, no longer trying to define it, no longer trying to control it, just allowing it to unfold, one moment at a time, until it became something that no longer needed to be questioned. The drawing did not leave his mind even after they stepped out of the hospital that evening. It followed him into the quiet of his car, into the controlled silence of his penthouse, into every space that had once been defined by clarity and precision, and now felt slightly altered in ways he could not fully map, because for the first time, something had entered his world that did not come with structure, did not come with terms, did not come with an outcome he could predict, and yet it stayed, steady and present, like the image of that third figure standing just outside the door of a house he had never lived in but was now somehow part of. And the next morning, when he returned again, the rhythm did not reset, it continued, as if the time in between had not created distance but had simply paused the motion. And Noah was already there, seated in his usual place, his small legs swinging lightly, a book open in front of him instead of paper this time. And when he looked up, the recognition was immediate, not just familiar, but expected. "You are late," Noah said, not accusing, just stating what he had noticed. And Ethan glanced briefly at his watch, then back at the boy, a faint shift in his expression, something closer to acknowledgement than correction. "I am," he replied, and Noah nodded, accepting that without further comment, as if the statement itself had already completed the exchange. And Ethan took his usual seat nearby, the space between them no longer uncertain, no longer defined by hesitation, but by something quieter, something that had begun to settle into place without needing to be explained. And across the room, Amara observed the interaction without stepping in, her attention divided but present, the same way it always had been. And yet there was something different now in the way she allowed these moments to unfold, less guarded, not because she had fully accepted it, but because she could no longer deny that something real had begun to take shape. And as the morning moved forward, Noah shifted the book toward Ethan slightly. "Can you read this?" he asked, and the request carried a different kind of weight, because it was not just about presence anymore. It was about participation, and Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, Because this was another step, another quiet shift that could not be undone once taken, and he reached for the book, his movements steady, deliberate. "I can," he said, and Noah leaned slightly closer, settling into place beside him without hesitation, his attention fixed on the page, and Ethan began to read, his voice even, controlled, but gradually softening as he moved through the words, adjusting without thinking, aligning with the rhythm of the moment rather than imposing his own, and Noah listened without interruption, his focus complete, and for a while, nothing else existed in that space except the quiet cadence of a story being read. Something simple, something ordinary, and yet it carried a weight Ethan had never associated with something so small. Because it was not about the story itself, it was about the act, the presence, the shared moment that required nothing more than attention. And when he finished the page, Noah looked up briefly, a small nod of approval. "You read good," he said, and Ethan allowed a faint breath of something unfamiliar to settle in his chest. Not pride, not satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement that this, whatever it was, mattered in a way he had not expected. And across the room, Amara had stopped moving for a moment, her attention fixed on them, not interrupting, not stepping in, just observing. Because what she saw was not forced, not rehearsed, it was natural in a way that made it harder to dismiss. And when Ethan closed the book, handing it back without lingering, without trying to extend the moment beyond what it was, Noah accepted it easily, as if the exchange had already reached its natural conclusion, and that restraint did not go unnoticed, not by Noah, not by Amara, because it reinforced something that had been building quietly over time, that Ethan was not here to take, not here to impose, but here to learn how to exist within something that had already been built. And as the day continued, the pattern held, the small interactions, the quiet presence, the consistency that no longer needed to be proven, only maintained, and later, as they walked toward the elevator again, Noah slightly ahead, his steps light, familiar with the path, Ethan and Amara moved side by side, not close enough to touch, but not distant either. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence carrying something that did not need to be filled. And then Amara glanced at him briefly, her expression steady, her voice low. "He notices everything," she said, and Ethan nodded once, understanding the weight behind the statement. "I know," he replied, and there was no defensiveness in it, no resistance, just acknowledgement. And that, more than anything else, marked the shift between them, because it was no longer about proving or denying. It was about recognizing what was already there. And when the elevator doors closed, the reflection showed them again, three figures standing closer than they had before, not perfectly aligned, not fully connected, but no longer separate in the way they once were. And Ethan understood then that this was no longer about whether he belonged. It was about whether he could continue to show up in a way that deserved the space he had been given, because what had been offered to him was not automatic, it was not guaranteed. It was something that could only be maintained through the same quiet consistency that had brought him this far. And as the doors opened and they stepped out together, the path ahead did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt deliberate, shaped not by control, but by choice, one moment at a time. The pattern held steady for days, then for weeks, not in a way that announced itself, but in the quiet repetition of presence that slowly reshaped something deeper than either of them had expected. And Ethan no longer checked the time when he arrived, no longer measured how long he stayed, because the hours he spent there did not feel like something that needed to be managed, they felt like something that needed to be honored. And that shift showed in ways he did not have to explain, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way he adjusted without being asked, the way he allowed moments to end without extending them beyond their natural place. And Noah responded to that in the same quiet way he responded to everything else. Not with excitement, not with resistance, but with acceptance, as if Ethan's presence had simply become another part of his routine, something that existed alongside everything else without disrupting it. And one afternoon, as the light outside softened into the early glow of evening, Noah sat with a small stack of flashcards spread out in front of him, his fingers tapping lightly against the table as he studied them. And when Ethan approached, he did not look up immediately, just shifted one card to the side before speaking. "I have spelling words today," he said, and Ethan took his usual seat, his attention settling on the cards without hesitation. "Do you want help?" he asked, and Noah nodded, sliding the first card toward him, and Ethan picked it up, reading the words slowly, clearly, then waiting, giving Noah the space to respond without pressure, and the boy spelled it out carefully, his voice steady, his focus complete, and when he finished, he glanced up briefly, not seeking approval, just confirming the exchange, and Ethan nodded once. "That is correct," he said, and they moved to the next word, and the next, the rhythm simple, consistent, and for a while, nothing else existed in that space except the quiet repetition of learning, the kind that required patience, attention, and presence more than anything else. And across the room, Amara watched again, her movements slowing slightly as she observed the interaction, because what she saw was not just participation, it was consistency carried into something more intentional, something that required effort beyond showing up, and that distinction mattered, because it meant Ethan was not just present, he was engaged, and that engagement was what shaped trust, not words, not promises, but repeated action over time. And when Noah reached the last card, he hesitated for a moment, his fingers resting lightly on the edge. Before he spoke again, "Can I ask you something?" he said, and Ethan's gaze lifted slightly, his attention sharpening in a way that did not interrupt the calm of the moment. "You can," he replied, and Noah looked at him fully now, his expression thoughtful, not uncertain, just considering. "Why did you not come before?" he asked, and the question landed quietly, without accusation, without emotion. Just a simple curiosity that carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, and Ethan felt that immediately, not as pressure, not as something to deflect, but as something that required honesty, because anything less would not hold in this space. And for a moment, he did not answer, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that this was not a question about the past alone, it was a question about presence, about absence, about something that had shaped Noah's world without him. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but softer than before. "Because I did not know," he said, and the simplicity of the answer matched the way the question had been asked, no explanation layered over it, no justification added, just truth presented in a way that could be understood, and Noah held his gaze for a second longer, as if measuring the answer, then nodded slowly, accepting it without pushing further, because for him, that was enough, and that acceptance carried a weight Ethan had not expected, because it was not conditional, it was not dependent on anything beyond what had been given in that moment. And as Noah gathered the cards, stacking them neatly together, he spoke again, his voice carrying the same quiet tone. "You came now," he said, and Ethan nodded once, the response immediate, grounded. "I did," he replied, and Noah gave a small nod in return, as if the two statements balanced each other in a way that did not require further explanation. And across the room, Amara's gaze softened just slightly, not in a way that could be easily seen, but in a way that shifted the energy around her, because she understood what had just happened, not in words, but in meaning, that a question had been asked, answered, and accepted without breaking the structure that had been built, and that mattered more than anything else. Because it showed that trust was no longer something being approached from a distance, it was something beginning to take form, quietly, steadily, without force. And as the evening continued, the rhythm remained unchanged, but the space between them felt different, not smaller, not erased, but more defined in a way that allowed it to be crossed without disruption. And when it was time to leave, Noah packed his things with the same care as always, his movements steady, familiar, and as they walked toward the elevator, he stayed closer this time, not by accident, not by hesitation, just by choice. And Ethan matched that without thinking, his pace adjusting naturally, his presence aligning without effort. And when the doors closed and the reflection appeared again, the three figures stood together in a way that no longer felt separate, not fully unified, not yet, but connected in a way that could not be undone. And Ethan understood then that what had been building was no longer fragile in the way it once had been. It had begun to hold its own weight, to exist beyond the individual moments that created it. And that meant the responsibility he carried was no longer about proving something. It was about sustaining something that had already begun to trust him to stay. The shift did not come as a single moment. It arrived quietly, layered into the rhythm they had built, until one day it became impossible to ignore, and Ethan felt at the moment he stepped into the hospital and did not need to look around to know where to go, because the space had already adjusted to include him. And when he reached the small table, Noah was not seated this time. He was standing, his small frame leaning slightly toward the hallway as if waiting for something. And when he saw Ethan, the reaction was immediate, not surprise, not curiosity, just recognition that settled easily into a smile. "You are here," Noah said, and Ethan nodded. His response just as simple. "I am," and there was no pause between them, no need to re-establish anything. Because what had been built no longer required confirmation, it existed on its own, steady and understood, and Noah stepped closer without hesitation, holding up a folded piece of paper. "I made something," he said, and Ethan took it carefully, unfolding it with a level of attention that reflected the weight of the moment rather than the object itself. And inside, the drawing was different from the others, not just in detail, but in placement. The house was still there, the tree, the figures, but this time, all three stood together in front of the door, not separated, not outside, but aligned in a way that had not been present before, and above them, a simple sun drawn in the corner, its lines uneven but deliberate, and Ethan's gaze lingered on it longer than before, not because it was more detailed, but because it represented something that had shifted without being spoken, something that had moved from possibility into inclusion, and Noah watched him closely, his expression calm, but attentive, as if waiting for a response that mattered, and Ethan looked back at him, his voice quieter than usual, but steady. "It is important," he said, and Noah nodded, satisfied with that, because for him, the meaning had already been clear before it was shared, and behind them, Amara stood still for a moment longer than usual, her eyes resting on the paper, on the alignment of those three figures, and something in her posture shifted, not outwardly, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone else, but internally, as if she was acknowledging a line that had been crossed not by force, but by time. And when she stepped closer, her voice carried a softness that had not been there before. "You worked hard on that," she said to Noah, and he nodded again, folding the paper carefully before handing it back to Ethan without hesitation, and that action carried more weight than anything else, because it was not just showing, it was giving, and Ethan accepted it with the same care, not treating it as something temporary, not something to be set aside, but something to be kept. And for a moment, the three of them stood there without speaking, the quiet filled with something that no longer needed to be defined, because it had already taken shape in ways words could not fully capture. And as the day continued, the rhythm remained steady, but the space between them had changed in a way that could not be undone, not reversed, because it had been built on consistency, on presence, on moments that had been allowed to grow without pressure. And later, as they moved toward the elevator, Noah did not walk ahead this time. He stayed between them, his small hand reaching out, instinctively, not for guidance, not for direction, but simply to connect, and for a brief second, it rested against Ethan's hand, not fully held, not fully claimed, just there, and Ethan did not react immediately, did not close his hand around it, did not make it into something more than it was. He simply allowed it, respecting the moment for what it offered without trying to shape it into something else. And that restraint, that awareness, did not go unnoticed, because Amara saw it, the way he held himself back, the way he allowed the moment to exist without claiming it. And that, more than anything else, shifted something in her, because it showed that he understood the difference between being present and taking control. And as the elevator doors closed, the reflection showed them again. But this time, the space between them was no longer defined by distance. It was defined by connection, subtle, unspoken, but real. And when they stepped out into the parking garage, the air carried the same quiet echo as always. But the moment felt different, more grounded, more certain. And as Noah climbed into the car, he looked back once more, his expression calm, but sure. "You are coming tomorrow," he said, not as a question, but as a statement, and Ethan met his gaze, the answer already settled. Before it was spoken, "Yes," he said, and this time, the word carried no uncertainty, no adjustment, just truth, and Noah nodded, accepting it without hesitation, because by now, that was enough. and as the car door closed and Amara moved to the driver's seat, she paused for just a second, her eyes meeting Ethan's through the open window, and there was no challenge there, no resistance, just acknowledgement, quiet and steady. Because whatever this had become, it was no longer something she could hold at a distance. It was something that existed in front of her, something that had been built without breaking what she had created. And as the car pulled away, Ethan remained where he was, the folded drawing still in his hand, not as a symbol of what could be, but as proof of what already was, something that had taken shape not through control, not through force, but through the simple act of showing up, again and again, until it became something that no longer needed to be questioned. The drawing stayed with him long after the car disappeared, not as an object in his hand, but as something that had settled deeper, something that no longer needed to be looked at to be understood. And the next day, when Ethan walked into the hospital, there was no hesitation in his steps, no pause at the entrance, because this was no longer a place he was entering for the first time. It was a place he had returned to enough times that it had begun to recognize him without needing to acknowledge him. And when he reached the familiar hallway, the rhythm was already in motion, nurses passing, voices low, the quiet hum of a place that carried on regardless of who came or went. And then he saw them, not at the table this time, but near the far end of the corridor, Noah standing beside Amara, his small hand resting lightly against her side, his posture calm. And when he noticed Ethan, the response was immediate, not just recognition, but something more certain, something that did not need to be confirmed. And he stepped forward without hesitation, closing the distance in a way he had not done before. And for a moment, Ethan remained still, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, because this was different. This was not a glance, not a shared moment. It was movement, intentional and unguarded. And when Noah reached him, he did not stop at a distance. He stood close, looking up with the same steady expression he always had, but now carrying something more defined. "I told my teacher you come every day," he said, and Ethan nodded, his voice steady. "I do." And Noah held his gaze for a second longer, then asked the question that had been forming quietly beneath everything else. "Are you my dad?" And the words did not come with hesitation. They did not come with confusion. They came with the same clarity he had shown in every other moment, simple and direct, and the space around them stilled in a way that was almost imperceptible, because everything else continued. The hospital did not stop, the world did not shift, but within that moment, something had reached a point where it could no longer remain unspoken, and Ethan felt that immediately, not as pressure, not as something to manage, but as something that required truth in its simplest form. And for a second, his gaze moved to Amara, not seeking permission, not asking for direction, just acknowledging that this moment belonged to all of them. And she met his eyes briefly, her expression steady, not intervening, not answering for him, just allowing the moment to unfold as it needed to. And when Ethan looked back at Noah, his voice was quiet, but grounded. "Yes," he said. And the word did not carry weight in the way he expected. It did not feel heavy or overwhelming. It felt right, as if it had already been understood long before it was spoken. And Noah nodded once, accepting it without hesitation, without needing further explanation, because for him, the answer had already been forming. The question had simply been waiting for the right moment to be asked, and then, without making it into something larger than it was, he reached out again, his small hand finding Ethan's this time without pause. And Ethan did not hesitate either, his fingers closing gently around it, not tightening, not claiming, just holding. And that simple contact carried more meaning than anything else that had happened before, because it was not built on assumption, it was built on acknowledgement, on truth spoken and accepted without resistance. And Amara watched them, her expression unchanged on the surface, but something within her had shifted, something that had been held carefully in place now adjusting to what had become undeniable. And she stepped closer, her presence steady, grounding the moment without interrupting it. And for a second, the three of them stood there, not as separate figures, not as something still forming, but as something that had already begun to take shape in a way that could not be undone. And as the moment settled, Noah looked up again, his voice carrying the same calm certainty. "Can you come to my school next week?" he asked, and Ethan felt a small shift in his chest, not hesitation, not uncertainty, just the recognition that this was what came next, not as an obligation, not as something to prove, but as a continuation of what had already begun. And he nodded, his answer immediate. Yes, I will be there. And Noah smiled, a small, satisfied expression that did not need to grow larger to be meaningful, because for him, that was enough. And as they walked together down the hallway, the movement felt natural, not adjusted, not measured, just aligned. And when they reached the elevator, the doors opened with the same soft chime as always, and the reflection in the mirrored wall showed them again. But this time, there was no distance between them, no space left undefined, because what had once been uncertain had become clear, not through force, not through explanation, but through the quiet accumulation of moments that had built something real. And as the doors closed and the elevator began its descent, Ethan understood that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something that would require the same presence, the same consistency, the same understanding that had brought him here. And for the first time, that did not feel like a challenge. It felt like a choice he had already made, one that would continue, not because it had to, but because it mattered in a way nothing else ever had.